Hey everybody, Chris here from It's Mead Made, and today I am going to be talking about the most important setting when it comes to resin 3D printing. So let's not waste any more time and let's get into this video. So a few weeks ago, Elegoo reached out to me and asked me would I be willing to try out their Mars 4 Max, their new 6K 3D printer. And I have heard nothing but good things about all of the Mars line 3D printers, so I was like, absolutely. So once it landed on my doorstep, I had the epiphany of like, oh man, now I've got to do all of the settings and calibrate this thing perfectly like all of my other 3D printers. So then I figured this is the perfect opportunity for me to show you how I actually find my perfect exposure settings when it comes to resin 3D printing. Now the one thing I will say, if you have been resin 3D printing for a long time now and you have your printers just dialed in perfectly, great. This video, honestly, it might not be for you. But I will say, if you have supports that break off while it's actually printing, maybe your exposure settings aren't perfect, and maybe you need to calibrate your machine just a little bit better. And that is what this video is all about. I am going to show you how I calibrate my resin with a new 3D printer or an existing 3D printer. So in this video, I'm going to be using the Elegoo 8K resin, and this is space gray. Now, you might be wondering, well, isn't the Mars 4 Max a 6K printer? Why are you using 8K resin? Because you can use 8K resin in other printers, and I am going to get a better, sharper result with this because, I mean, we're only 2K away from 8. Why not? So I'm going to be using this to be able to get the best results I physically can get. Now, before we get deep into the weeds, I want to just take 1 second for you new people to resin 3D printing to just kind of explain why our exposure settings are so vital. Now, I'm going to first just assume that you understand how a resin 3D printer works. Now, what happens is we have the screen on the bottom, it lights up with a UV light, and our resin is actually UV sensitive. So when a UV light hits our resin, it hardens and cures. And what it does is it turns on the light for a few seconds, turns it off, the plate lifts up, and then it comes back down with just whatever our layer height gap is, and then turns back on, cures to the last layer, then it turns off, and then it lifts up. And it just keeps doing that whole thing back and forth until we have a full 3D print. Now when it comes to our exposure settings, that light is coming on and off for potentially thousands of layers when it comes to a full 3D print. If your exposure setting isn't right, you have all of those opportunities for every single layer for something to go wrong if your settings aren't correct. That's why we want to make sure that our number is 100% accurate. And what we're going to do is do some tests because we don't want it underexposed or overexposed. We want it exposed perfectly. Now, if your 3D prints are underexposed, some of the issues that you could be facing is delamination. So delamination means your layers are not sticking together fully, or they're starting to peel apart like this. You're not exposing that resin long enough for it to actually fuse and bond to that previous layer. And you can also get them to not stick to your build plate. So if your build plate is actually printing and then suddenly it pulls off of it and it stays in your bed, that means you are not exposing your bottom layers enough. You can also get weak points for underexposed 3D prints, and you lose intricate details. So if you have a lot of textures and details in your prints and they're just not showing up like you think they should, underexposed might be the issue. Now on the flip side of that, when it comes to your 3D prints being overexposed, that means your light is on too much and it's over-curing and overexposing that resin. And let's just say this one I hate because you can lose a lot of detail because you get light leaking. And what is light leaking? Light leaking is essentially when it is shining through, it actually is going out farther than it should in that resin. So it is expanding your 3D prints. So if it's like this big and you get light leaking, your layers could get who knows how big because you are exposing it too long and it's starting to go outside of the edges where it should be curing. Now, the big thing here, if you have overexposed prints, your dimensions can be affected, let's just say how you probably don't want them to be. Especially if you're printing figurines of there's sockets and little pegs that they gotta fit in, and they're not fitting at all, you might be overexposing because it's not fitting and you're changing the dimensions of those 3D prints. You also might be losing your details. Just like I said, underexposing, overexposing can also lose details because it's bridging those gaps and kind of just bleeding everywhere, and you want those sharp edges and you're just not getting them. So I guess this is really a Goldilocks scenario. You don't want your porridge too hot, or you don't want your porridge too cold. You want it just right. And honestly, maybe that's not a good analogy of it, an eating analogy with resin. Don't eat resin. I'll just say that right now. Safety disclaimer, resin, bad, don't eat. Porridge, good, you can eat. And I don't even know what porridge is. Is it like oatmeal? Well, we got pretty far before I started digressing. So let's get back to this. Alright, so essentially what we're going to do is we're going to find our perfect exposure settings for the Mars 4 Max, and using this 8K resin. So, let's jump over to the computer and I'm going to show you the steps we're going to take. So the first thing that I always like to do is I always go to the manufacturer's website of the resin, just so I can see what their recommendations are when it comes to what the settings need to be, just to give us a good starting point or a baseline. Now the great thing about Elegoo, they have great support. And all you have to do is go onto their main page, elegoo.com, and then come up here to the top support tab, go to Troubleshooting Resin Setting Guide, this right here. Then, right at the very top, you can see Elegoo Printer's Resin Setting Sheet, and this is what we're looking for. So I'm going to go ahead and click this, and now this will actually give me all of their recommended settings for all of their different printers and the resins for those printers. Now the only issue I have is they don't have the Elegoo Mars 4 Max with the 8K standard resin. Now they do have the Mars 4 Ultra, and this is the recommendations. They think the bottom layer should be 36 seconds, the normal exposure time is 4 seconds, and this is a layer height of 0.05. So these are the settings that we are going to use. And Elegoo also told me, for your convenience, they put this directly on their product page, down here at the bottom, where it says Product Guides and Documents. And they have the PDF right here for you to download. So now we have our recommended settings from Elegoo. And this is going to be our base setting where we start, because we always want to test our 3D prints. We don't want to ever just go with what the manufacturer recommends, because, big key here, that is a recommendation. It's not the absolute. Now, when it comes to the 3D print test that we're going to be using, I like to use the validation matrix. There are so many different tests out there. This is just one of them, and you can find different versions of this specific one. The one I'm using is on Thingiverse, and you can just go and see the link below and grab that file if you want to follow along with me. So once you have that file, you can actually throw this into whatever slicer you're going to be using. Because the big thing here is, it doesn't matter what slicer you're using. You can be using Lychee, you can be using Chitubox, you can be using whatever you want. The key here is you are trying to find the right exposure setting for your bottom layers and the right exposure setting period for your 3D prints. So let's go ahead and jump to the computer and I'll show you how we're going to change our settings in Chitubox. Alright, real quick, I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you to all of these amazing people for supporting me on Patreon this month. If you want to be like these people, you will get exclusive access to my private Discord channels where we talk about everything 3D printing and painting 3D prints. If you're interested, the link's below. Other than that, let's get back to the video. So once you have your file in Chitubox, or whatever other file you might be using for your validation tests, you are ready to start putting in those settings from the manufacturer. Now, if you're in Chitubox, you want to come over here to Settings, then you come over to Print, and you're going to find the settings that you need right here. So layer height is the first one. I am going to be printing at a 0.05 millimeter layer height. Then you have your bottom layer count. And I typically like anywhere between 4 and 5 layers for my bottom layer. And then if you move on down here where it says bottom exposure time at 36 seconds. Now that was the recommendation from Elegoo, and that is typically what I keep my bottom layers at, because you want to ensure that those bottom layers are cured extra well. That way you can get a good adhesion to that build plate. Then we have our exposure time. Now, with my exposure times, I'm going to be doing 3 tests just to ensure that 4 seconds is going to work for me. So I'm first going to set this to 3.5 seconds. Then once I have all of that done, I am just going to hit close. Now all I have to do is slice my file. And the great thing about ChitUbox is the exposure time is right here, and you can change this on the fly and keep saving out different files. So for right now, I am going to save this one at 3.5 seconds. So once you hit save, the dialog box will pop up, and I am going to name this one 3.5 seconds exposure test. And I'm going to hit save on that. Then I am going to click right here and then do 4. So leave that at 4. You can see that our time changes just a little bit. Then I'm going to hit save again. And I'm going to name this the same thing, except for I'm going to label it 4 seconds. And then save this one out. Then the last one is I'm going to make this at 4.5 seconds. And then save this one as well. And I'm going to label that, you guessed it, 4.5 seconds, and then save it. So I'll make sure that all of the files are on my USB drive, and then go plug it into my printer, pour in just a little bit of resin, because you don't need much for these tests. One thing I have to mention. When we are 3D printing our calibration tests, it is vital that we are only washing them. Now, I am only washing mine in isopropyl alcohol with the Mercury X, and this wash station does a perfect job. So you can put the build plate right in there and just turn it on for a few minutes to wash. And that's what I've been doing. So be sure, only wash it, do not cure it, because that is key. I just want to take a quick second and just say thank you to Elegoo for sending me this amazing 3D printer, the Mars 4 Max. That is what I'm using for this entire video to test out all of these calibration exposure settings. There are so many cool little features on this printer that I have really enjoyed. Like, the vat actually has a max fill line, which is easy and a simple thing, but it is great. And then the little feet where they can actually lock in onto the screen and setting it down to where you don't have to worry about the FEP actually touching the surface. And when it comes to the build plate, I love that it's got this texture to it, and it's a super low profile, which means you can fit more resin in the vat. And the carbon filter, that is so nice to have on a resin printer. And I know Elegoo has been putting this on a lot of their printers lately, and it is really a nice feature to have. If you're interested in this printer, I've got a link for it down in the description below. So I have my 3 calibration tests, and what this one is right here, this is at a 3.5, then I also did this one at a 4, and I also did this one at a 4.5. So 3.5 seconds, 4 seconds, 4.5 seconds. Then what I went ahead and did was I went in between these because I felt like this was really good, but I wanted to see if I needed to go a little higher or a little lower with my exposure. And that's why I went by half seconds. So then I did a 3.75 and then a 4.25 seconds. So let's zoom into these really closely so you guys can see why I chose the number I chose. Alright, so starting with the 3.5, we are going to look at this one. Now, you can see that I didn't clean this good enough, but the thing about cleaning these is you've got to be very delicate with them because you don't want to mess up any of these pieces. So I went ahead and just kind of sloshed this around, and I could have used like a little sponge or something like that to clean it off. But at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter because I am using my gloves because these are not cured. Now, when I look at the 3.5, there's a few things that like kind of call to my attention. The first one is the bend. Like the corners were peeling just a little bit, and it did not get that great of an adhesion. Because like you can even see how it rocks back and forth. Like it actually is curved, and to me that means it is not exposed enough. So this is some underexposure. Like that's a big sign for me. Then what I'm going to look at is always this tip right here and see what it looks like at that center point. And let's go ahead and really zoom into this. So once we really look into this, like at the very core of that, at the dead center, you can see that there is actually some gaps there. And just with the human eye, you cannot fully tell. And once I put some magnifying glasses on, I could see that easily. And when I'm looking at it through this macro lens. Now the other thing to note is these lines right here just did not print. It looks like some of them printed and maybe they broke off, but it did not turn out very well. So the gaps here, this did not look very good, and you can see there are some gaps in between these points. Like these corners should be hard and touching each other, and you can see slight gaps in between them. And that's one of the big problems with reading some of these tests, because it is so hard to see with the naked eye, because like you can see like there's little pieces in here and things like that I didn't even see. And that was probably from the cleaning. And like this is just a little bit of a flake of one of these lines that comes out. So you really want to look at these tests. And when it comes to the holes, you want to look at all of the little pins and make sure that they're all printing as the same amount of holes that are printing. And you can see a little tiny hair right there. Wow. But for the most part, I realized that this is underexposed because of these gaps. And the gaps are really what you want to look at. So if there's big gaps or any kind of gaps, you are underexposed. So 3.5, we've realized that, you know what, this is not it. And that's why I went to a 4-second exposure. Now, when we come to the 4-second test, you can see that there is a little bit of, stuff right here. And this, honestly, just could be extra resin, or it just has a little bit of a blur, which means this might not be the right setting. But the other things we need to also look at and determine are these lines and zebra bars down here. This actually turned out really nice because all of the lines printed out, and if we come on down to the other side, every single line printed. Then if you see the little holes, and coming down here you can see all the little pins. So this was actually a really good print. Even though we're having a tiny bit here, but sometimes this is as good as you're going to get. But I didn't stop here. So that's why we're going to move on to the 4.5 seconds. Now when we look at the 4.5 seconds, you can see that there is a lot right here. And what this can mean is this is overexposed because how these just connect like this. And if we look down here, these got brittle and broke off, but over on this end, they actually printed out pretty well. Then if we actually look at the holes, they actually didn't print out too well. You can see right here, like the holes actually filled in really early, and the pegs turned out okay. So this actually has some signs of overexposure because of how they actually bleed together, and also that the lines right here, they just kind of connect. You can see all of these little corners, they're connecting, and it's not just a point to point. So that is a sign of overexposure. Now when it came to those results of the 3.5 seemed underexposed, 4 seemed pretty good, and 4.5 seemed a little overexposed. So I went ahead and printed this one. This one is a 3.75. Now you can see these points are, it looks like there's a little gap right here, and it does look like they're touching well, and we can see that there is just a little bit of resin here. Let's try to clean that. Okay, so I cleaned that a little bit more, and you can see that there is a slight gap in between there, and it looks like it's touching pretty well. And I cleaned this with a paper towel, and now you can see all of these little fibers all over it. But if we come down here and we looked at the zebra striping, now this is where these did not print too well at all. Like they are very brittle and they started breaking off, it looks, and some of these didn't even print fully. And when we come down here, we can see the same thing. There are a few pieces of it, but it did not fully print. So just looking at this test right here, the 3.75, I know that this is not as good as my 4 seconds. So now if we go up to 4.25, we can see that some of these edges and things are rounded off, and it does connect a tiny bit, but not much. Coming down here, you can see that some of these did not print, and these lines didn't print very well, and you can see that there are some bleeding on the corners, how it's coming towards each of the points where they connect. Then down here, the same exact thing. You can see how they fill in, and some of these corners are actually rounded, and these lines did not print. So things being rounded like this and how they flare out a little bit, that is a good sign of overexposure. And this is so slight. I mean, we are talking about just tiny, tiny bits. So if we look right here, so if we look at this end and see how this actually printed, and then we do a direct comparison of the 4 seconds, you can see how these lines all printed out well, and they're just touching on the tips. Now there is a little bit of that rounded corner, but remember, look at how zoomed in we are. And to give you some an idea of, this is a ballpoint pen. This is the point of a ballpoint pen, and I'm using an actual needle right now. And honestly, if I was going to select anything between a 3.75, a 4, and a 4.25, I think I would be perfectly fine. But I think my best results were out of this 4 seconds. So I am going to go with 4 seconds for my exposure time. Now the big thing here, I just want to say that the 3.75 and the 4.25 are good examples. Like, these are actually good enough to where I could print with these and never have an issue. Because they're clear prints, a lot of it printed out well, but when it comes to the comparison to the 4 seconds, you can just tell that this is the winner. And this is what you're wanting, because you have to look at the point here. You want this to be a perfect point on each side. If you have all of these lines printed out, and all of these holes and pegs are printing out really nicely, that is the key. That is the big thing. You want to look at all of these things, because you can't just look at the tip and say, oh, this doesn't look good, but all of these printed and everything else looks really good. That's why there's multiple things to check here. So at the end of the day, I'm going to be going with a 4-second exposure setting. Now when it comes to the details that we're wanting with this 6K screen, these little details absolutely matter. This could be the difference between having one of those little hairs or teeth on a 3D print, super sharp and fine pointed, versus they are only getting like details this thick. So the big thing here is I just want to make sure that you don't just look at one setting, because I've seen some people that print these out and say, yep, you just want to look right here, as long as this is good, you're good. Not true. I think you need to be looking at all of these things to be able to make sure that everything is going to print beautifully for you. So let's go into Cheat U Box, and I am going to set my settings to 4-second exposure. Then let's go print some stuff and see how it turns out. So once you think you've found your perfect exposure settings, I strongly recommend printing something not huge. Now, I printed out a bunch of little minis because they were only like a 3 or 4 hour print. I actually chose some minis that I know have a ton of detail in them because they're from Cast and Play and the Dragon Trappers Lodge. They both produce amazing minis that have crazy detail. So I figured if I can actually print these successfully, there's nothing I'm going to be able to throw at this that it can't print. So I went ahead and just took their pre-supported files, and one thing I like to do is I load up my build plate all the way because I am fully trusting that my new setting is going to work beautifully. And guess what? I was right. It actually worked beautifully, and these prints are fantastic. When it came to this golem, I absolutely loved how it turned out, but I think I was more impressed with the little hoppers. And let's go over to the table and let me show you some close-ups of those actual prints. Now when it comes to the results of this, once we're dialed in, look at these teeth. I think this is honestly the best example I could physically give you. I mean, it printed every single tooth. And these things are so fine. I mean, it is ridiculous of how small this is. This is a ballpoint pen. And look at the size. These teeth, it's remarkable. And you can also see the layer lines of the 0.05 layer height. So when it comes down to it, this thing really printed out beautifully. When it comes to all of the details and overhangs, I mean, it got every single one of them. Then I printed out this guy, and he is like, the detail on this is ridiculous. It printed this beautifully. Now, there's not a lot of sharp points on this, but when it comes to all of these little tiny grooves, and you can just see everything. And it did an amazing job at it. And when it comes to getting any kind of these overhangs, the supports completely took care of them. I mean, this is so delicate, it's ridiculous. And the detail in all of the wings, the tail, the feet, I mean, it just looks fantastic. But you can also see how smooth this is, because this is supposed to be like a stuffed animal version of a hopper. And it looks fantastic. And I'm also super happy with how this resin turned out, because it's got a little bit of a flex to it. It's not super brittle, because there have been other 8K resins that I've used in the past, and even water washable resins that are crazy brittle. And you can see that this has a nice little flex to it, because these little tiny points right here, they could break off really easily, but they're not. This will definitely come in handy when I start painting these and they don't break off with my brush just hitting it. Now you have all of the knowledge you need to be able to find your perfect exposure settings for your resin 3D prints, which are going to give you just beautiful 3D prints. Yeah. And I also just want to say thank you again to Elegoo for sending me this Mars 4 Max. It has been awesome to 3D print on, and I've really enjoyed it so far. And if you're interested in this or the wash and cure station that I was using in this video, go ahead and look in the description below, and I've got a link for you guys. Other than that, I wish you a great day, and I will see you guys in this next video right here.